Men attack elderly woman without knowing her rescued dog was a former police officer. Margaret was beloved by everyone in her quiet little neighborhood on the outskirts of Santiago. She was a kind-hearted elderly woman with silver hair and a warm smile that could brighten anyone's day. Always by her side was Bruno, her loyal German shepherd. Bruno had a sleek black coat and sharp, intelligent eyes, exuding both strength and devotion. Years ago, Margaret had found him at a shelter, frightened and underweight. She hadn't hesitated to take him home, and since that day, Bruno had become her steadfast companion and protector. "We're a team, aren't we, Bruno?" Margaret often said as she stroked his head. In return, he would look up at her with unshakable loyalty. Margaret's mornings were peaceful, following a routine she cherished. She would take Bruno for a walk along the cobblestone streets, greet neighbors with her cheerful wave, and stop by the local bakery to pick up fresh bread. Bruno was always by her side, his sharp eyes taking in every detail, his presence a quiet reassurance. But that particular morning, Bruno's behavior was off. He was unusually tense, pausing every few steps to sniff the air and glance around with heightened vigilance. His ears were perked, his posture alert. But before we dive into what happens next, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from today? Drop a comment below. "Bruno, what's gotten into you today?" Margaret asked, patting his head in an attempt to calm him. But despite her soothing tone, Bruno remained uneasy, his sharp focus unbroken. He gently tugged on the leash as though urging her to return home. Margaret chuckled nervously. "Maybe you can sense the rain coming," she joked, brushing off her own unease. When they reached the bakery, Margaret couldn't help but notice two unfamiliar men lingering across the street. They seemed to be talking, but their eyes were locked on her, making her skin crawl. She tried to dismiss the feeling, telling herself she was imagining things. But Bruno noticed them too. He let out a low, rumbling growl, his body rigid as he stared at the strangers. The two men, Raúl and Mateo, exchanged a few quiet words. Raúl nudged his companion and murmured, "She lives alone, just her and that dog. It'll be easy." Mateo gave a brief nod, his gaze following Margaret as she exited the bakery, a loaf of bread in hand. Margaret couldn't shake the sense of being watched as she hurried home. Bruno's uneasiness only heightened her own. "What's wrong, boy? You're acting like you've seen a ghost," she said, her voice tinged with concern. As soon as they reached the house, she locked the door and took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. But Bruno wasn't ready to relax. He stayed by the door, his ears perked and his eyes fixed, his low growl echoing through the quiet room. Outside, Raúl and Mateo watched the house from the shadows. "She's just an old lady with a dog," Raúl said with a sneer. "Once we deal with the mutt, it'll be a piece of cake." Mateo hesitated, eyeing Bruno's silhouette through the window. "That dog doesn't look like it'll go down without a fight," he replied. Raúl smirked. "We'll take care of it. Come back tonight when it's quiet." Inside, Margaret tried to settle in with her book, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Bruno was pacing near the door, stopping every so often to growl softly. "What's gotten into you?" Margaret asked, closing her book. She walked to the window and peered outside, but the street was empty, cloaked in the quiet of the evening. "There's nothing out there, Bruno," she murmured, though her heart told her otherwise. As night fell, Margaret double-checked the locks on her windows and doors before heading to bed. Bruno stayed by the door, his body rigid, his gaze unwavering. Margaret tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Hours later, the quiet of the early morning was shattered by the sound of metal scraping against the lock. Bruno went rigid, his growl low and menacing. Margaret, half asleep, mumbled, "What is it now, Bruno?" But the sound of the door being forced open jolted her awake. Two masked men burst into her home, their movements swift and menacing. "Stay quiet, lady," Raúl barked, his voice cold and threatening. "We don't want to hurt you, just hand over your valuables." Margaret froze, her heart racing as fear took hold, but Bruno didn't hesitate. With a fierce growl, he lunged at Raúl, sinking his teeth into the man's arm and dragging him to the ground. "Get this dog off me!" Raúl yelled, writhing in pain. Mateo stepped forward, pulling out a knife, but Bruno turned on him with the same ferocity, forcing him to stumble back. Margaret, trembling with fear, grabbed a heavy vase from a nearby table and struck Raoul as hard as she could. Staggering, he shouted, "We're not sticking around for this." Matteo, clutching his injured arm, nodded. The two men fled into the night, leaving Margaret and Bruno alone once more. As silence returned to the house, Margaret knelt beside Bruno, tears streaming down her face. "You saved me, Bruno," she whispered, her hands trembling as she stroked his fur. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Bruno, though exhausted, stayed alert, his eyes fixed on the door as though ready for the next threat. Margaret knew then that he was far more than just her companion. He was her guardian, her protector, and her hero. Margaret spent the rest of the night sitting beside Bruno, her hand resting on his strong, steady frame. Though her nerves were frayed, she felt a deep gratitude for the unwavering loyalty of her protector. Outside, the night had grown still, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins wouldn't let her relax. Bruno remained by the door, his eyes sharp and ears twitching at every faint sound. As the first rays of dawn broke through the curtains, Margaret mustered the courage to call the local authorities. Her voice trembled as she recounted the terrifying events of the night to Officer Ramirez, who promised to send a patrol car immediately. When the officers arrived, they were greeted by Bruno, who stood at the door, watching them warily. "Good boy, Bruno. It's okay now," Margaret whispered, stroking his fur to calm him. Officer Ramirez, a kind-faced man with an air of quiet authority, knelt down to address the dog. "He's remarkable. Not many dogs would have the courage to take on two intruders like that," he said with genuine admiration. Margaret offered a small, weary smile. "He's more than just a dog to me. He saved my life." As the officers inspected the damage to the door and took Margaret's statement, Bruno stayed close, his eyes following their every movement. Officer Ramirez took careful notes, his brow furrowing as Margaret described the intruders. "We'll circulate the description and patrol the area. It's likely they'll try to stay low for a while, but if you notice anything unusual, call us immediately," he advised. Before leaving, another officer handed Margaret the number for a local carpenter to repair the door. "We'll increase patrols in this area," he assured her, "but I'd also recommend reinforcing your locks. Your dog is incredible, but we don't want you to have to face anything like this again." Once the officers were gone, Margaret looked at Bruno, who had finally begun to relax. "You're my hero, Bruno," she said softly, kneeling beside him. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Bruno wagged his tail faintly, leaning into her touch, as if to say he was just doing his job. Later that day, Margaret contacted the carpenter and arranged for the door to be repaired. The man arrived quickly, a burly fellow with a reassuring smile. Bruno, ever watchful, sat nearby, keeping an eye on the stranger as he worked. Margaret couldn't help but laugh at her dog's vigilance. "He's not going to let me out of his sight for a while," she remarked. By evening, the door was as good as new, and Margaret felt a flicker of relief. But Bruno's protective nature hadn't waned. Even as she prepared dinner, he stayed near her, his gaze constantly shifting toward the door and windows. A few days passed, and though the immediate fear had subsided, Margaret couldn't shake the memory of Raoul's parting words. "This isn't over." She began taking small precautions, keeping her phone close and avoiding venturing out after dark. Bruno's heightened awareness kept her grounded, reminding her that she wasn't alone in her worry. One afternoon, as Margaret and Bruno returned from their usual walk, a black car with tinted windows slowly rolled past her house. Bruno immediately stiffened, his ears pricking up and his eyes narrowing. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine as the car came to a halt a few houses down. She quickly ushered Bruno inside and peeked through the curtains. The car lingered for a few minutes before driving off. Though nothing happened, the encounter left Margaret unsettled. She reported the incident to Officer Ramirez, who assured her they would investigate. That night, as she sat in her armchair with Bruno lying at her feet, she thought about the events of the past week. She realized how much her life had changed because of Bruno. Not just his bravery during the break-in, but the constant sense of security he provided. Margaret leaned down and gently kissed the top of his head. "You're my guardian angel, Bruno," she said, her voice filled with love and gratitude. Bruno responded with a soft huff, his tail thumping gently against the floor. Though the shadows of danger still lingered, Margaret knew that as long as Bruno was by her side, she could face whatever came her way. Leave a comment if you enjoyed this story. It doesn't cost you anything and you'll make me very happy. Thank you, and I look forward to your like.